Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to introduce you James Watson, who is here for a while already. He's a visiting professor, and he will stay here until the end of May, right? The end of May. Well, John got a PhD in 2011 in marine science in the University of California, Santa Barbara. And then he got a postdoc position researcher at Princeton University in 2 departments from 2011 to 2014 in the Department of Geosciences and later in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Since 2017, he has permanent position. First, he was an assistant professor initially in the Oregon State University. And since 2022, he is associate professor in College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences. So you see that his interests are mainly related to marine science and ecology, but he loves complex systems in general. He got several awards, the last 2, the DARPA Young Faculty Award in 2017 and the Oceanography Society Early Career Award in 2020. Interestingly, he is co-founder and manager of Clearwater Analytica, a data science company focusing on advancing and applying machine and transfer learning method for the prediction of harmful algal blooms in lakes and reservoirs. So that would be very interesting. And today he's going to talk about data and society and etc. Thank you very much, John, for being here. James, for being here.
Okay, thanks, Claudio, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone.
Sorry, Claudio, we cannot hear anything here. The people on Zoom cannot hear anything.
And now in 3D. Hey, is it good? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Better?
Yes.
You didn't miss anything. I was just saying thank you to everyone and you guys online as well. Thanks for saying that. So where was I? Yeah. So this has got a very broad title, this talk. And yes, I'm going to talk a lot about a lot of different things on the surface in the spirit of trying to start many different conversations in which we can go deeper. Okay. The other thing, 2 other things. Claudio, thank you. I do want to give you special thanks. I mean, you brought me out here and it's I'm very grateful for this opportunity to come here and to collaborate with everyone. Second, I have my 3 children at the back there. You want to put your hands up? That's August, Layton, Zoe. They are in school. They're Americans. They don't speak Spanish, but I put them in Spanish school, which is just down the road, and they're loving it. But I yanked them out so that they could come see me give this talk. It's the first time that they've ever seen me give a talk. Maybe the last. I don't know. Depends how it goes. But children. Oh, actually, so yeah, a couple of things. I need 2 pencils or a pen. Can you give one pencil to them? I've tasked them with thinking of a question for me at the end of my talk. Okay, and kids, if you ask me a question at the end of the talk on my research, you get an ice cream.
Me too.
No, wait. This okay, anyone who asks me a question, no, I don't have enough money for that, but please do. Okay, all right, so let's start here. I don't think anyone's going to argue with me if I say that we live in a complex and dynamic world. And what this means is that the scale and connectivity of human impacts is presenting an existential risk to the continuation of society as we know it. This can all be thought about using the concept of planetary boundaries, introduced by a team led by Johan Rockström back in 2009 out of the Stockholm Resilience Center. And the idea is simple. There are thresholds in certain factors of the Earth system that define a safe operating space for humans. And beyond these thresholds, or planetary boundaries, as they're called, we start creating an environment that is not conducive for human flourishing. You can think of this as being a game of tug of war, where new technologies are constantly pulling us towards particular planetary boundaries. So this is true for the Industrial Revolution, of nuclear power, of artificial intelligence, antibiotics, CRISPR gene editing technologies, and so on. And on the other end of the rope, pulling us away from these planetary boundaries, are our governance institutions.
Well, not all.
How so?
Not all the government institutions
Sure.
are on that side.
Sure.
That's also a problem.
Okay. Well, yeah, agreed. But the crux of the problem is this: the rate at which our governance institutions and others are adapting to these new technologies is far slower than the rate at which these technologies are adapting themselves. And this is creating a condition for what is known as a rate-induced tipping point. So many of you will be familiar with the idea of tipping points, regime shifts, bifurcations, critical transitions, these kinds of things, which typically we're taught about using a double well potential diagram. And rate-induced tipping, as it's known, is a relatively recent contribution to this. And it describes how the whole stability landscape shifts very quickly, creating a regime shift or a critical transition. Now, there's an analogy here to updates in computer hardware and software. Specifically, what we're seeing is that our societal hardware is being updated through technological advances, but we're not seeing the necessary concomitant update in our societal software. This is everything, not just governance institutions, but our individual norms, habits, behaviors, and then all the way up to global and national level laws and policies. So this would be like trying to run a brand new iPad with an old Mac OS. It just wouldn't work. So to make best use of new hardware that we're creating, we need new software. So this is generally true, I think, but what I want to do in this talk is use the oceans as an example of how specifically this presents a challenge to us. So even though you might look at the oceans, maybe not you guys, but maybe my kids, sorry to pick on you, might look at the oceans and think it's rather simple, a very well-mixed system. We know that it's quite the opposite. And in this talk, I'm going to talk to you guys about different types of complexity exhibited by the oceans. Specifically, we're going to talk about how ocean currents move planktonic organisms around, creating complex spatial patterns of connectivity between marine habitats. Then we'll briefly explore the connectivity of marine food webs and how allometric scaling laws can help us model future changes in the abundance of fish, as well as new methods for machine learning that are helping us predict nonlinear dynamics. We'll also talk a little bit about the complexity inherent to our use of the oceans. And last, I'm going to use all of this stuff about the oceans to have a conversation with you about new ways in which we can understand collective behavior in human groups. Okay, so the first topic of spatial complexity. Now again, go to the coast and you might imagine, we're going to go to the coast maybe this weekend. You look out at the ocean, and you might think a well-mixed soup. But if you look at it another way, say from space, you can see that there is significant dynamic spatial structure. And it's on these physical structures that tiny microscopic organisms live and grow. These are the plankton, right? The wanderers of the ocean. And so here, my work back in Southern California, where I did my PhD, is where I did this work. Now, the Southern California bight, as it's known, down towards Los Angeles, has these amazing kelp forests. Here we have seagrasses, but over there we have these big kelp forests where there is an abundance of marine life. Now, kelp requires rocky substrate on which to attach. And on the left here, I'm showing you a map of where the rocky reefs are in the Southern California bight. I'm doing this to point out to you that the habitat is not continuous, it's patchy. This is relevant because the species that inhabit these kelp forests don't move much as adults. they basically stay in one place their whole lives. That is, except when they're born as tiny eggs or larvae. And it's in this life stage that they drift with ocean currents. And ocean currents can disperse these baby fish extremely long distances. We're talking about tens to hundreds of kilometers. So the fish I would catch off Santa Barbara, I didn't actually catch any fish. I'm that bad of a fisherman. Might have been spawned all the way down in Mexico, actually. And so this is the same story we have here in the Mediterranean too. So this spatial connectivity created by ocean currents means that to understand and even predict fish population dynamics, we need a quantification of coastal connectivity. And we do so using Lagrangian particle simulations. That's what I just showed. And it's from these Lagrangian particle simulations that you can construct what are called Lagrangian probability density functions in 2 dimensions. And it's from those Lagrangian PDFs that you can construct what we call a connectivity matrix. So a connectivity matrix describes the probability of a baby fish dispersing from one kelp forest to another, given that it was born there, and then it can settle there to grow to be an adult. And what we've discovered is that coastal connectivity varies greatly between species, that it's asymmetric, so the probability of going from here to there is not the same as going from there to here, and shows strong temporal dynamics. Now, with these quantifications of coastal connectivity, we can then develop spatially explicit models of the dynamics of marine species. So these can be called metapopulation models, and they can range in complexity and simplicity. The ones I've been using have been quite simple, and what we can do is put inside them the connectivity matrices. So this leads to spatially explicit simulations of the population dynamics of marine fish that includes their connectivity as well. So Amelia, when we discussed this is one way in which I've factored in habitat quality to factor into the probability of water moving to the probability of a larvae moving. So these kinds of models are what can be used to help design policies for sustainable use of the oceans. So most notably in the design of marine protected areas. So these are areas of the oceans that are off limits to fishing and other human activities, and they can act as seed banks for marine life. When I was doing this work, the governor of California asked that 20% of the coast be designated as protected areas, and my contribution was to just explore the usefulness of network theory for helping to identify important places. So this was quite a while ago, and it was still, newish to use network theory in this context. But basically, some places, some rocky reefs, some kelp forests in the Southern California Bight are more connected than others. And this can be quantified using various connectivity indices. We focused on centrality metrics, eigenvector centrality, for example. And then this helps inform the choice of where to place a marine protected area. Now, there are many other ways in which ocean connectivity is helping advance understanding. And I've been working over the years on a variety of projects. For example, I've looked at how climate variability and change alters patterns of connectivity through time. So I've been talking to Lucas about time evolving networks, because that's essentially what this is. I've worked with Ernesto Villarino and Guillaume Schust up in the north of Spain to explore global connectivity patterns and its impact on planktonic biodiversity, making use of the Malaspina dataset. And one other thing that I've mentioned in one of my meetings is I've been exploring how to calculate empirical measures of connectivity using a combination of drifter data and shortest path algorithms like Dijkstra's algorithm, for example. With that, instead of focusing on probabilities of transport, you can estimate things like minimum transport times, which is useful in other contexts too. Okay, so now, in addition to spatial complexity, which I've just described, another very, very important form of complexity in our oceans and in the natural world more generally is in terms of ecological complexity. And by this, I mean food web interactions that describe who eats who and how biomass is transferred between individuals of different species. So this topic dates back, decades, if not centuries, but one of the first main uses of mathematical analysis on food webs was done by Vito Volterra, who co-constructed the Lotka-Volterra equations. Another notable figure, at least in my training, has been the late Bob May, who did many things, including the foundational work on the dynamical stability of food webs. Now, in marine food webs, they can be complex, consisting of interactions between viruses and bacteria, to phytoplankton, to zooplankton, to small fish, to medium-sized fish, to larger fish, and so on. And this complex web of interactions can be overwhelming for a modeler. And indeed, that's what theorists like Bob May have, why they have sought mathematical abstractions that are more amenable to modeling, but that still remain useful. So one way of looking at marine food webs is through their size spectra. So what I mean by this, if you observe things that are feeding in the oceans, one thing that you can find, a recurring pattern, is that big things eat smaller things. As shown in this fossil here. If you're ever in Princeton University, it's up there somewhere, and I just took a photo of it. It's quite incredible, actually. It's of a medium-sized fish eating a smaller sized fish and trying to eat it too fast and presumably dying on his last dinner. So these allometric scaling laws are evident across orders of magnitude in terms of body size and abundance in the oceans. Essentially, there are slightly less, as well as who eats who, the big things eating smaller things, there are slightly less big things than there are small things. And these scaling laws enable us to construct size-based models, representations of marine ecosystems. So without modeling the full dynamics of every single species, which quickly becomes unwieldy, you can construct a model abstraction that simply says big things eat medium things, which eat small things, and so on. And doing so allows us to then model marine food webs from the smallest organisms up to the largest, even at a global scale. So modeling marine ecosystems at the global scale is helping us to understand how climate change is going to impact the availability of marine seafood as a source of income and food for millions of people around the world. And when I was doing this work, I was at the Geophysical Fluid Dynamics Lab, which is next door to Princeton, working with these wonderful guys who are now part of a much bigger community of international scholars developing these kinds of global fish models. Some, not all of them size-based, but many of them are. Now, in the previous figure, you might have noticed that something was missing. Specifically, there was no mention of human impacts on the structure and dynamics of marine food webs. And omitting human activities would be wrong. We now have enough data to show that fishing happens everywhere and to a large extent. And that this has greatly altered the structure of marine food webs around the world. So this is a satellite image of the location of fishing vessels integrated over time over the last 10 years or so, showing you where we have fished. It is basically the whole oceans. Now we fish for many reasons. First, some people fish for food, but actually most industrialized fishing operations fish for profit. And so some important questions are that we need to answer are, well, where do fishermen fish? Why do they go where they do? And third, can we predict illegal fishing? Because it turns out around 20 to 30%, so getting up to a third of all fish eaten, has been caught illegally. And so this is actually a huge problem that needs addressing. So in one project, what we've done is to use satellite data to construct estimates of Lagrangian coherent structures. That is what we can see here. The Lagrangian coherent structures are the spaghetti diagrams under the blobs. The blobs are fishing vessels. So we have data both on Lagrangian coherent structures and fishing. So if you don't know, I know some of you do, Lagrangian coherent structures are derived from estimates of Lyapunov exponents for the surface ocean here in 2D. There are different kinds of Lyapunov exponents, finite size, finite time, but essentially those Lyapunov exponents measure the rate at which things diverge or converge in the surface ocean. And we think this is where things might aggregate, like phytoplankton, like zooplankton, like small fish, and so on and so forth. And great work from folks here have shown that some marine top predators do actually appear non-randomly associated with these Lagrangian coherent structures, things like frigate birds, baleen whales. And for a little while now, I've been thinking about and studying, well, what about people? What about humans? What about tuna fishermen, for example, not just tuna? So, and yes, to cut a long story short, what we've found is that in certain places around the world, certain fisheries are non-randomly associated with these fine-scaled physical features. But it does depend upon the place and the kind of fishing that's going on. In another project, this one funded by the US Department of Defense, of all places, we've been using this very same kind of spatial data in combination with fisheries economic data to compute what's called the natural capital asset price for fish stocks. And now this might seem totally dry and like economics and nothing to do with complex systems, but it's a decades-long effort by economists to put nature on our national accounts. You've heard of GDP, gross domestic product. I don't know what it would be called in Spanish. It's GDP. Okay, it doesn't account for nature. So if we go and demolish all the fish stocks in the Mediterranean, the Spanish GDP wouldn't change. Okay, there is a huge effort by economists to change that. Okay, and this is one way in which they're exploring it. And in other words, it's a way of doing non-market valuation of natural assets. So fisheries, the mountains, the tramontana, the water. How can we put a price on these things, a value, measure the value of these things? I put this up here because actually there's some really interesting social ecological dynamical modeling that goes under the hood to make these calculations. And we can get into this in a bit more detail if you want. Well, we're using this modeling framework to understand when nations actually might come into conflict with one another over shifting access to fish, specifically through the ideas of value asymmetry. So this is when a fish stock moves across a jurisdictional boundary. Today, you might have access to the fish stock to the value, but in the future, the species is going to shift into another nation's jurisdictional boundary, and that's an asymmetry in access that could lead to conflict. And the other one is value compression, where climate change is basically squeezing the amount of suitable habitat into a smaller area, increasing the density of competing nations for that marine resource. Okay, so that was a quick overview of how both ecological and human complexity is apparent in marine systems. Now, I want to just add a little bit more about the new work that we're doing on the use of machine learning to predict nonlinear ecosystem dynamics. So we knew that ecosystems exhibit nonlinear dynamics, such as regime shifts or critical transitions. And so specifically, ecosystems can have, we know that they can have multiple dynamical attractors, and exogenous changes can lead to the system flipping from one stable state to another. This is known as a regime shift to ecologists. So for me, I know you guys might think about it in terms of Posidonia, but I think about this in terms of coral reefs. That's how I learned about this, which typically exists in a hard coral dominated state or regime. But certain changes in the environment, such as increasing temperatures, lowering pH, or increasing fishing, can flip a coral system into an algal dominated state. Now, in general, mathematical biologists, such as some of us here, look for mathematical representations of the systems that we study and perform analysis to identify qualitative properties of interest, such as the existence of multiple dynamical regimes or these kind of critical transitions. The challenge is, from an operational perspective, we want to be able to actually predict these regime shifts. And the mathematical models that we have can actually perform quite poorly in this regard. This is in contrast actually to empirical methods used by empirical ecologists who use very advanced data analytic techniques. So think of your favorite machine learning approaches. Now, data-driven methods are good when you have lots of data. For example, in some of the coral reefs that we've been working with in Hawaii, we have quite a lot of long time series of transect surveys with which we can parameterize these machine learning models. However, for numerous systems around the world, we just don't have that much data. So in these cases, wouldn't it be great if we could in some way substitute data with theory? Or more generally, is there a way in which we could use both theory and data to make predictions of nonlinear dynamics, say of ecosystem regime shifts? So this is the motivation behind a set of techniques to have recently emerged from the computer science community. The first technique is something called a neural ordinary differential equation, or NODE. This is where a universal approximator like a neural network is used to describe the time derivative of a quantity of interest, say the abundance of a hard coral on a reef. The second technique that very much builds upon nodes are universal differential equations, or UDEs. So this is where you have some system and the truth is out there, as can be represented by, say, a set of differential equations, but you only know the partial truth. You know from observation and study that perhaps prey species X has the potential to grow exponentially and the predator species Y can collapse. You might also have collected just a little bit of data and you have observed an interaction between the predator and the prey that you believe could couple their dynamics, but you don't know exactly how. Well, in a similar way to how nodes work, you can use the property of neural networks as universal approximators to learn from the data, the missing terms that couple the predator and prey dynamics. In doing so, you can then make predictions that accurately capture the nonlinear dynamics exhibited by the predator-prey system, again, only by training on a small amount of data highlighted in orange. Just to reiterate, it's only by combining the mathematical theory, so the symbolic math, the equations that we have, with the little bit of data that we have, that this machine learning can reconstruct the nonlinear time series, where other machine learning methods would fail given that small amount of data. Now, one could go a step further and apply sparse or symbolic regression to the neural networks and recover symbolic representations of the interaction term. And in this way, we're using machines to do theory, actually. So this is what we've been doing, funded by NSF, and we're working with guys at Julia Computing. Hands up, who's heard of Julia Computing or uses Julia? One. Good for you. It's good. Well, they're really cool, and Julia's great. But our plan is to actually develop an R package for predicting. Our deliverable to NSF is to develop an R package for predicting marine regime shifts, focusing on corals, but also including mangroves and harmful algal blooms in freshwater lakes. This is something I would love to think about in terms of Posidonia. We talked about this, Damien, and potential regime shifts as the temperature warms. Some way of thinking about how this can dovetail or marry with the pattern formation work that you've been thinking about. I'd love to keep talking about that. So in general, this work on predicting regime shifts using machine learning is part of our bigger effort to be prepared for regime shifts. So other work in this area has focused on dynamical early warning signals to anticipate regime shifts. So some of you might have heard of Tim Lenton, most likely Martin Schaefer, who have pointed out that the Earth is on track to go through many tipping points if we don't curb our carbon emissions, which is not something we're likely to do. So we need to prepare for the Earth going through these regime shifts, and the best way that I can think of is to have as early warning as possible that we're approaching them. Some work that I'm actually doing in this area, some theory, has been to explore the impact of these early warning signals themselves on human well-being. So, for example, I'm talking about early warning signals. This relates to critical slowing down near a bifurcation. And one empirical feature that occurs as you approach a bifurcation is something called dynamical flickering. So, for example, you might start with a system, so this could be a fishery system, and you have a high abundant state here at the top, where you've got lots of fish. But as a bifurcation parameter increases, say the harvest rate, you can push the system into a low abundant state, which is shown at the bottom. The problem is, yeah, but the point is people actually might be able to adapt to this case, or even this case. People in the Mediterranean might be able to adapt to a non-Posidonia world, given enough time and resources, right? It's when you approach the tipping point, the bifurcation, that we see these dynamical systems flicker between the possible states. And this is when we actually might see human well-being minimal, because people just don't know which state to adapt to. And they spend money and time and resources adapting, holding on to the past, not adapting to the future, or adapting to the future too early, and flip-flopping themselves in their strategies for adaptation. Okay, now it's because of this, these early warning signals actually themselves not just potentially providing a use in terms of predicting or anticipating when a regime shift is going to happen, but actually impacting a negative impact on people themselves. I've been talking with Simon Levin, Juan Bonacella, and Miguel Angel Munoz about the possibility of new kinds of early warning signals based upon changes in the effective dimensionality of complex systems as it undergoes a regime shift. And this is also something I'd love to talk with you guys about. I've been talking to Sandro and Lucas about this as well. And there's a rich vein of work to be done there. Okay, so the last thing to say is in a lot of my work, the word collective comes up a lot. And I've noticed its use in economics, in ecology, sociology, and in the complex system sciences too. And what I want to present to you as the last block of work is perhaps a flawed but maybe useful extension of this thinking to collective consciousness. So the idea is this. In my work, I've looked at a number of complex systems, as I've showed. For example, I've studied how and why birds move together in flocks, as well as people. I've studied food webs, and I've looked at how financial markets actually can be thought of performing some kind of computation. Excuse me. Now, these are the systems I've been thinking about lately. And more recently, as I've showed you, I've been using tools from machine learning like neural networks to make predictions of nonlinear dynamics of complex systems. And it's in doing so, and in reading up on the history of AI, that I found an interesting story. That is, the grandfathers of AI actually didn't want to use the terms like neural networks or artificial intelligence. So John McCarthy said as much, and Herbert Simon wanted instead call neural networks complex information processing units, which I think is a much better term. And this can help us question whether complex systems are complex information processing units, and in a way act to integrate information. So is a flock of birds a complex information processing unit? Or is a food web or a financial market or a human group? It's much easier for me to guess yes to that question, actually. So this brings us to integrated information theory, which is a theory of consciousness. Much written about, actually, and very recently hotly debated, created by Giulio Tononi and very much championed by the likes of Christoph Koch, amongst others. IIT, as it's known, has two parts. First, a set of axioms and postulates that define consciousness. This is basically the philosophy of consciousness. But second, it consists of a mathematical framework that makes use of a lot of do calculus, in which one can compute a measure of consciousness known as phi. And phi, in the terms used by IIT, measures the level of information integration. And recent works by the likes of Alex Mayer, Pedro Mediano, and others have explored whether this notion of information integration can actually help explain complex systems more broadly. So my work here has been to question whether human groups from small to large can act as complex information processing units using IIT and the metric phi. And I've been wanting to test the hypothesis that the more a human group is able to integrate information, the better they are at problem solving. Ooh. Now, in a nutshell, this is how IIT works. In contrast to standard approaches to network representations of complex systems, which very much work on the basis of pairwise interactions or correlations. This is my social network. That's my wife in the middle. That's me on the end. IIT thinks of complex systems, mostly brains, as consisting of connected elements. In the brain, this would be a neuron, but in a human group, this would be an individual. Now, elements that can have different states, most basically on or off, and their state is determined by inputs that it receives from other elements. So for example, I might have element C, which receives inputs from two other elements, A and B. What we want to know are the conditions for when C is on. So we can conduct experiments. When both A and B are off, C is also off. When A is on and B is off, C is still off. When B is on and A is off, C is still off. It's only when A and B are both on that C turns on. And here we can see that C is in fact an AND gate. It is on at time t+1 when its inputs are both on at time t and off otherwise. And this is how you construct a transition probability matrix of system states. So it's not an adjacency matrix where the rows and columns would be nodes, but instead rows and columns refer to possible system states now and in the future. So here, for a system comprised of 4 elements, all the possible configurations of system state at time t on the vertical axis, leading to updated system states at time t+1 on the horizontal axis. Now, it's from this TPM, this transition probability matrix, that you calculate phi using a lot of do calculus and a lot of for loops. Empirical applications of IIT in neuroscience have been restricted to EEG measurements of the activity of small sets of neurons. But for my study of human groups, I've started exploring whether we can usefully apply IIT to other complex systems. And yes, I think we could do something here with animal groups such as starling murmurations or schooling fish, both of which I have data for. But actually, I've been focusing my time on sports team data, specifically player position data from soccer. I've spent too much time in the US, or football matches. Originally, I'm English. So instead of neurons in a brain, the elements that are on or off, active or inactive, are individual players. And the goal is to be able to calculate phi for each team and to study them using IIT and to study them as complex information processing units, solving a collective action problem, which is to win. And the hypothesis we want to test is that the more a team is able to integrate information as measured by phi, the more they win. So for a football match, there are 2 teams of 11 players, and player position data is now regularly collected, although it can be difficult to get. Thankfully, I've been collaborating with Xavier Bouldu over access to the Spanish La Liga football data. The process that we're working on is to use the time series of player positions to derive time series of activity. Just like a neuron might be on or off, we can do the same for football players. The intermediate step is to examine player speeds, as shown here on the right, where we have 2 time series of speed for 2 players. If we simply look at the histogram of speeds, you can often find a bimodal distribution where one mode relates to players just walking around and the other relates to running. And we can use this information to basically say that when a player is running, they are active, and when they're walking, they are inactive. Another way to look at these data is in the time series matrix of all player speeds for an entire team. That's on the top right. So player ID on the vertical and time on the horizontal axis. And what's cool about this chart is you can see collective behavior, periods of time where everyone is slow and where subsets of the team speed up together. Interestingly, I think there may be avalanches in these time series of speed, indicative potentially of criticality, which is something I'd like to explore too. Anyway, it's from these player time series, speed time series, that I can compute activity time series. So binary time series on or off, which I'm showing you down here. And it's from this that I can compute the transition probability matrix for each team. The bad news is that the transition probability matrix grows very large very quickly. So if we just have 2 elements, the TPM has a total of 16 entries. At 6 elements, it's up to over 4,000. At 11, we're over 4 million. And beyond that, it becomes completely intractable to calculate. So the way I'm dealing with this right now is just to compute a TPM for all possible unique pairs of players, like these 2, or 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 these 2. And to cut a long story short, we can apply integrated information theory to the transition probability matrices for all pairs of players in a given team. So for one match and one team, for example, Real Mallorca, I would get 45 time series of phi. That is, there are 45 unique pairs of players in a set of 10 players, because we exclude the goalie. Similarly, for Athletic Club, we also have 45 phi time series. This wasn't from the final, just letting you know. First off, the phi time series show non-zero values, identifying that football teams do actually integrate information. Does this mean that they're conscious? Maybe. There's a whole philosophical debate that we could wade into there. But what I've been doing is to simply explore the hypothesis that the better teams are more conscious. That is, the teams that win more should have consistently higher phi values. And indeed, this is what we see. So the top teams, so I just picked out Barcelona, Real Madrid, and Atletico Madrid. They win a lot. Consistently, they have larger values of phi relative to the all other teams. So here are two probability density functions of phi of all matches of all player pairs for the top teams in red and the other teams in blue. And with some simple statistics, it's confirmed that the top teams have a significantly larger values of phi consistently. In a similar way, we can hypothesize that for each match, the teams with a relatively large phi should score more, or at least shoot more on goal. This would be evidenced by a positive correlation in this space, where the x-axis would be a difference in the average phi between two teams playing one another, and on the y-axis would be the difference in the number of shots on goal, again, for a specific match. Each dot will be a match. Okay, so this is what we did. We've got 100 matches, and this is the result that we find. Indeed, a significant positive relationship. Again, each dot is a match. On the x-axis is the difference in phi for team 1, take away team 2. And the y-axis is the difference in the number of shots on goal between team 1 and team 2. This positive relationship highlights that the measure of consciousness, called phi, is able to describe some aspect of the performance of human groups, such as football teams, as they integrate information. There's a lot more we need to do before this goes any further, though. And indeed, one thing I'm particularly interested to explore, again, ideas for collaboration, is whether football teams operate near criticality, as has been proposed for many other complex systems. I'm also repeating this analysis I just showed you. I did this for pairs of players for each team, but I can do it for triplets. But when I get to quartets, my computer starts breaking down. And indeed, I think a major challenge is to be able to speed up these kinds of hypergraph computations, because that's what this is. The transition probability matrix is essentially a representation of a hypergraph, or a graph with higher order interactions. And developing methods that can overcome the computational challenges that I've faced would be a big step forward. Okay, so let's finish. It might seem weird that I'm studying how football teams integrate information using theories of consciousness, but the motivation is actually to better understand how groups of humans, perhaps all of us globally, can work together to solve some of the biggest challenges facing humanity. We've faced existential risks in the past, such as nuclear proliferation in the 70s and 80s. And now with climate change and the emergence of new technologies, such as artificial general intelligence, we're facing more and more existential risks to the planet as a whole. And this is why I'm showing you a picture of the late Elinor Ostrom. So she was a Nobel Award-winning economist who focused her work on the importance of cooperation, in solving collective action problems, such as the tragedy of the commons. And I think it's the work that we've been doing, using a framework to essentially understand how neurons cooperate with one another in the brain to create a well-functioning whole, can be applied to understand how globally we must learn to cooperate with one another in order to transform the challenges that we're facing now into opportunities for a good future. Thank you so much. Sorry to jump upon so many different topics, but I'm trying to spark as many collaborations as possible. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, James. Question, please.
So thank you very well. Can you hear me? I guess so.
I can hear you.
Okay. No.
I know.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Did we meet last year?
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly.
good,
I was
good,
going
good.
to say, I just remembered that you also did this very nice talk. Well, all Americans, you do very nice talks. You train that much more than we do.
Well,
Anyways, I had maybe a few remarks, but I'll just skip them. And I'll just go to this last part when you were talking about phi and the theory of consciousness. So, for example, you showed this example of the network of nodes that did logical operations. And there, the transition probability matrix, well, it was, you could only go from one state to another state. There was only one element per row, right? And I guess if you have complete information of a system, for example, let's say I computationally have a model for neurons, then that would be the case as well, right? I follow deterministic rules, and then from one state I go to another state. So, but in the example with the football players, no, because you're kind of coarse graining, all the brains of the players, and you don't have all the absolute, let's say, information on the system. So how does this, does this phi change depending on how much information you actually have when modeling the system? What are the properties? Do you know properties of the probability transition matrix, so that how this affects phi? Because for me, I was like, okay, so maybe if I model better or worse, I'm going to get maybe completely different results. I don't know.
Okay, so a couple of things. Yes, spot on. Your intuition is completely right. And one of the reasons why my analysis works is because I chose 2 players to do it 2 at a time. Because when you have these time series of player speeds, they're really fine scale. They're for 90 minutes for the full match. With 2 players, you can efficiently or effectively or accurately construct the transition probability of those 4 different states, on, off, of the 2 players. If I had the full 11 team and I had however many, like gazillion, 4 million possible states, I might not have enough data to perceive and then quantify the probability of every single possible kind of transition. And that's a problem, sure. And I think that's what you're getting at. If you had a model, or if you had an infinite resources in experimenting with a brain, you could do that.
For example, let's say I have complete information. Let's say I have again like this kind of network of nodes that perform logical operations between them, right? And so I have all of them with perfect information and the rules completely deterministic. And then I start, as you said, I start looking at them without looking at the others. So in that case, how would the phi change in the system? That's kind of my question. So how does it depend on the actual information that you're, that you don't know, or that you're coarse graining, or things like this?
I don't know the answer, to be able to be honest. I think to give a poor answer, there is a lot that goes on that I haven't shown. A lot of assumptions about the scale of analysis. Yes, there's a lot of coarse graining that goes on, averaging in many different dimensions, and it's still not clear to me what the best formal approach to the application of integrated information theory and the computation of phi to messy, complex systems for which we have limited data for. So that's not a great answer for your question.
No, but thank you very much. I love this.
I would say, though, that the TPM itself has got a lot of rich information in it, and IIT and phi comes from the TPM, but there's many other things we could do with it that are faster, actually. Yeah, sorry, go.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. I'm curious about the part in which you were discussing basically how to infer some equations from your data, given that you have some information and how to reproduce some system of ordinary differential equations, if I remember correctly.
Yeah.
So we were discussing in a journal club and another piece of software that that does this kind of job. It was a Bayesian mechanism. So are these guys that had like a prior distribution that they extract from the bunch of formulas that you have in Wikipedia, and then you have a random walk from there and reconstruct possible formulas for your data and things like that. And we tried that on different problems, but we weren't very satisfied, because then the formulas that we get, or the theory, let's say, didn't respect things that would be very important for people doing theory, like dimensions, like the dimensionality of your constants, or is your theory respecting the symmetries of your problem, or things like that. So how do you, in your experience, does this kind of formulas work well for a theorist?
Same problem. But by the way, you guys both get ice creams, just so you know, kids. Yeah, so the two main approaches to this sort of symbolic regression, well, it is symbolic regression, and then there's SINDI. Maybe there's this Bayesian approach too. And it's just like you said, basically you have these curves that you're trying to find functions that approximate them, and you'll have this huge library of possible functions. And one approach might use a genetic algorithm to try and find, okay, this combination of functions creates the minimum error or something like that. And it's just an error minimization problem. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we've explored its usefulness in the context that I just showed. We've done it in other systems for which we have data too. And we consistently come to the same problem that you have, which is that it'll give you a set of sets of ordinary differential equations that vary in complexity. But even the simplest set of differential equations that it suggests created that dynamic that you've observed will have loads of exponents, will have the wrong, well, not the wrong, but like a huge dimensionality. And so it's an interesting thing to note that the human theorist has a bias towards Occam's razor, right? We want the simplest model that explains the phenomenon that we're observing, and we're very good at that, and we can create an abstraction that has meaning to us. But we're not there with the machines yet. Yeah, so, but no, I think there's great promise to this. I mean, we can retrain these kinds of models to have our own bias as well. And there are successes. The symbolic regression work that we've been following was done by a guy who rediscovered Newton's laws of motion accurately, you know, from data on planetary position, right? And so you can reconstruct simple symbolic representations of the system that have meaning to us, but not in these complex systems that are difficult for us. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Questions? Emilio?
Can you say some words on how this phi quantity is computed? It's based on what? I mean, is it too difficult? Don't worry about it.
It is brutal. I'll just say, I mean, I mentioned it in passing. You get the transition probability matrix, and then essentially there's a lot of do calculus. And if you're not familiar with do calculus, there's this, it's a huge area of theory dedicated to understanding causal mechanisms. And the reason why these computations take so long is because, as I mentioned it, there's just a lot of for loops. There's no beautiful math. There's just simply a lot of cutting and seeing what happens, reattaching, seeing what happens. And so you're doing that within the context of the transition probability matrix to, yeah, say whether this thing causes, whether this soccer player passing the ball causes that other soccer player to do something. And yes, the papers on integrated information theory are horrendous, but we can maybe start reading some of them if you want to know more about integrated information theory.
I have two questions, comments. Miguel might remember better than me, but we used to combine data, machine learning algorithm together with equations, right, Miguel? And we usually get better predictions when combined, even if the model is not very good as compared to the real one, but combining model with some recurrent neural networks or any machine learning algorithm with time evolution, we used to get better prediction, right, Miguel? So do you try that anytime? No.
Yeah. I mean, this is, maybe we're redoing some of the work you've done, but that has always been the test. Yeah, to try and measure the value of theory, to say, okay, if I have some time series of Posidonia or kelp forests, can I predict next year's value based upon what I've learned? If you give it just, you know, LSTMs or neural networks, or the just purely data-driven approaches, you get an error, some measure of accuracy, and then you can see how the accuracy changes as you coarse grain the data. You give it less and less data, and you see how the performance drops off. This is the test we've been doing, but now in the two space, I have data density, so I can give it lots of data or less and less data. I can give it lots of theory in terms of the mathematical models, and then less math. And in the two edge cases where you've got lots of theory and lots of data, you should be able to have the best predictions. And that's what we're generally observing, but there is some interesting curvature into space. And that's what's most interesting to me, because in reality, we're limited in how much data we can collect. And I want to know, instead of writing a proposal for $20 million to go get more instrumentation to measure more things, what if I said for $2 million, we just need more theory and we can get the same accuracy? That would be really cost effective.
And the second one is, as you know, also in neuroscience, it is not easy to do measurement, single cell measurement for many neurons simultaneously. But what they usually do is the local field potential, which is the main activity of several neurons. And from there, some people are able to extract individual information with spike sorting or things like that. Have you tried something like that for the football players?
No. The only thing I've tried is this, and then I've only been thinking about measuring how close we are to criticality. And I bring that up because I bumped into Miguel and Jan Munoz like last week or so. We were talking about this. So yeah, I'd love to think more about these things with you and alternative ways to use these data. I mean, Xavier Bouldoux has been doing an amazing. I've been very impressed with the amount of complex systems approaches being applied to football, but there's lots more that could be done actually, and not with the intention of helping Real Mallorca win every single match, although that would be cool. But again, like I've shown here, like using that as a stepping stone to understand how other human groups, communities, and maybe globally we can understand how to figure stuff out.
Anyone in the online wants to make a question, just unmute and ask the question. If you are awake. If not, the kids, you want to make a question to your dad? Not here, later. Okay.
Very disappointed.
So, James, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, then. Thanks. Sorry, like I know you've seen that talk before. So
What?
you saw this. It was very similar.
I know, I don't remember the things.
Okay. Well, thank